So I'd like to start by telling you a story about a girl I once encountered. Like me, she was Eastern European, but where exactly in Eastern Europe, nobody was quite sure, because you see, she actually couldn't talk. When she was found wandering the streets of Dublin, she was lost, disoriented, confused. She looked like she'd been abused, like she'd escaped from somewhere, and she couldn't speak a word. It was a few days before she felt comfortable enough to communicate in any way at all. And at that moment, people realized that this was much worse than just an abuse victim. You see, she drew pictures. And in the first series of pictures, she was a stick figure being put on a plane, and it looked like she was put on that plane against her will. In another series of pictures, she was on a bed surrounded by men. These were not pictures you wanted to see. They were incredibly disturbing. And it became clear to the police that they were dealing with a victim of sex trafficking. I mean, a young girl, she looked like she was probably about 14 years old, maybe 15, alone in a foreign country. I mean, of course she couldn't speak. I certainly wouldn't have been able to speak in those circumstances. And so they spent hundreds of hours, hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to establish this girl's identity, trying to figure out who she was, where she was from, so that they could help her, so that they could reunite her with her family and help make her whole. And it worked. It paid out. They were actually able to find who she was. Her name was Samantha, or Sammy, as a party. Except here's the thing about Sammy. First, she was Australian, spoke perfect English. Second, she wasn't 14, she was 27. Third, she'd never been abused in her life. She came from a very nice family in Australia. She was a serial con artist, an imposter. She was someone who had pulled this off many times before and would go on to do it again. By the time we catch up with her in Ireland, she has already been convicted twice of fraud in Australia, didn't serve either sentence because she's very persuasive and very personable. She's gotten the Australian government to think that she's a victim of familial sexual abuse. They put her in a very nice boarding school. After she's deported from Ireland, she ends up coming back there, conning a family into hiring her as an au pair for their 2 sons, who she proceeds to take care of. And then she says that, she's the victim of a bastard royal marriage and nobody wants her and she has to flee. Goes to Canada. Same story, this time she's a victim of rape. Canadian government spends hundreds of hours, hundreds of thousands of dollars figuring out who she was, deports her to Australia. At this present day, she's used more than 40 aliases and has done a version of this con in multiple countries. And let me assure you, her time in the spotlight is far from over. So when I first encountered Sammy, I thought, oh my God, I actually see a bit of myself in her because I'm a writer, I'm a journalist. I write stories, I write for The New Yorker. I spent 3 years with con artists writing about people like Sammy, telling their stories. And to me, one of the things that governs my life is the notion that what I do matters, that storytelling matters, that the pen is mightier than the sword, as they say. And what I saw in her was me, but in some inverted, perverse funhouse mirror. She is also a storyteller. She weaves powerful narratives, except instead of doing it to show the truth, to actually help make the world a better place, she does it to deceive people. I mean, think about how pernicious what she's doing is. Instead of helping real victims, she's got the police force looking for her. She's the center of attention. Actual lives are at stake, and here they are catering to her whims. And I think that that is what really kind of drew me to these types of people, to understand that stories aren't just powerful for the good, which is how I've always wanted to think of them, how I've always thought of them, but that stories can actually be very destructive, and that in the wrong hands, stories are incredibly dangerous. Stories are kind of the oldest language we have. In many ways, they predate verbal language. You've got the Lascaux cave paintings telling stories of, fabulous hunts. You can imagine cavemen sitting around the fire before they can talk, saying, "Oh, there's a bear over there, and the god is angry. The river is flooding. There's stuff going on." So stories are just something that we use to draw us together and to communicate. And in fact, pre-verbal language might be more powerful in some ways than words. And so Sammy didn't actually need to talk in order to convey such a powerful narrative. In one study, psychologists actually had people look at people who were acting in a play. And they had them judge what was going on, the emotion, the action, kind of what was happening on stage. The thing was they couldn't actually understand the words were masked. And they found that nonverbal cues were 22 times more effective in predicting how people would judge the action, and that they were 4 times more predictive of the emotion that the actors were feeling than the words themselves. So even when they totally masked the words, people still could tell the story. And that shows just how powerful some of these methods of storytelling are, how emotional they are, on what a basic level we are able to communicate. And in some ways, that's why stories are so dangerous, because emotion isn't like fact. Emotion is not something that you challenge in the same way that you challenge logic. I mean, what kind of a person does it make me if a girl comes up to me and looks lost and can't talk, looks like she's been abused, and I say, "Are you who you say you are? Have you really been abused? I don't know if I can help you without proof." Who would do that? I mean, I would be a terrible human being. Of course I'm going to go out of my way to help her. Of course I'm going to come along because I don't even think I'm going to be deceived. And what ends up happening is that we believe stories even when we know they're fiction. We can actually get by different facts in them and think that they're true. So there's a Princeton University psychologist, Deborah Prentice, and in 1997 she ran a really interesting study. She said, what would happen if I had people read excerpts of novels, so something that they know is fiction, with some facts thrown in, because fiction writers like to put in a few facts. How will they actually see the world? Are they going to question the facts? So for instance, there's a novel from the 80s called The Lyre of Orpheus. And in it, there's this woman, Maria. And Maria says something about fetal alcohol syndrome. She says, you have to drink so much in order for fetal alcohol syndrome to develop, which is scientifically completely false. You actually only need to drink a tiny amount. All that matters is timing. But what ended up happening is that when people read excerpts from novels, knowing they were excerpts from novels like that, they believed the fact as well as the fiction. Even such whoppers as the sun is actually good for your skin. People read that and were like, oh, interesting, I guess the sun is good for me. I'm gonna go sunbathing, I'm gonna have vitamins develop and all sorts of great stuff. And so what happens is you are so caught up in the action that you no longer question the facts, you just assume they're true. And the first time I read through this study, I thought, I don't think this study is for real. How could that ever happen? And then I noticed that it had happened to me. I was having a conversation with some friends, and I was telling them in vivid detail about the streetcars in Union Square in the 1800s and how there used to be really dangerous curves and a lot of people died. There were some fatal accidents and nobody would fix these curves. And my audience was listening around dinner being like, oh, that's really interesting. I want to read this history book, Where can I read about New York in the 1800s? And I thought about it for a second and I realized it's from a novel I read. So I have no idea if any of those details are actually true. I had just assumed this and was now telling it to someone else as fact. Stories do that to us. They make us not motivated to question. So Daniel Gilbert at Harvard University says that we actually see the world in 2 steps. So our first step is assuming everything is true. And then we verify it. We say, oh, is it actually true or false? I'm going to tag it accordingly. So I actually see this as the pink elephant view of the world. So when I say pink elephant, all of a sudden, for a fraction of a second, you have pink elephants who are going to be jumping around in your mind before you realize, oh wait, pink elephants don't actually exist. I need to fix this belief. Pink elephants are false. When you're listening to a story, that second part doesn't actually happen. You don't notice you're surrounded by pink elephants. And so suddenly you have a stampede of pink elephants that's careening around Union Square, causing fatal streetcar accidents. And you're just fine. You think, oh, yes, this is the way the world works. And this is what stories do. This is why stories are powerful. This is why people like Samantha Azzopardi are so incredibly dangerous. Because think about how surrounded we are by stories. Everyone is telling us stories. Politicians tell us stories. Journalists like me tell us stories. Entrepreneurs tell you stories, foundation myths, how they got started. They say that in law, the person who wins the case isn't the lawyer with the best evidence. It's the lawyer who presents the strongest story. That's who the jury is going to go with. And I realized, spending so much time with con artists has definitely made me cynical. I've emerged thinking, people suck. Everyone is going to deceive you. You should just, lock away the key, throw away the key, lock your door. Just don't trust anyone. Whenever you hear a sob story, you better get fact-checking. And now I realize that's not actually true. Samantha Azzopardi is an exception. Not everyone is out there conning. But my cynicism has actually kind of paid off in the sense that, I have an alert out for all of the con artists I wrote about, including Sammy, just to see, will they rise again? And a few weeks ago, I got an alert in my mailbox. I think she probably knew I was going to be doing a TED Talk about her. And so all of a sudden, I get this alert, Samantha Azzopardi. I click on it to see what it is. Lo and behold, another victim. This one's an American student. And Samantha posed as an 18-year-old teenager sharing a hostel with her in Australia, somehow managed to convince her that Interpol was after both of them. This poor girl ended up getting fake IDs made, got deported from Australia because she'd broken the law, and now has a criminal record. So this poor girl just didn't even know what hit her. She thought that she was helping a friend, and it ended up it was Samantha Azzopardi. And so when you see stories like that, you realize the pen is mightier than the sword, and it is a double-edged sword. So it's something that has to be wielded with a lot of care. When I first met the story of Azzopardi, I've actually never met her in person. I wish that would have happened, but she never agreed. I wonder why. When I first encountered the story, I thought, why does she keep doing this? And I think I might have the answer, and it lies in the power of stories. So there's another now cliche that comes from George Orwell, which is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The power of stories can corrupt you. I think she might have gotten carried away by her own silver tongue, by her own ability to do this, because it's addictive. Realizing that you can control people's lives with the stories that you tell. It's a huge power that we storytellers hold. And it's a power that I think needs to be wielded wisely and wielded, with a lot of restraint. Because one of the things I realized is that stories on their own have absolutely no moral compass. It's only the people who tell them who have the moral compass. And it's incumbent on us as storytellers, as story listeners, to trust but to verify, and to make sure that the stories that become truly powerful, the stories that are told and retold, are the stories that deserve it. Thank you.